Okay, so this is the Kyosho Inferno 10 electric conversion build series. As you can see, I actually have quite a lot of the build done already. I didn't really spend time making videos as I was progressing through the build. I just wanted to try to get a fair amount of this done. But there is some stuff to comment on for the build. For the most part, all I really did was just take the car apart, clean up all the parts and put it back together. With the exception of doing the modification for sealing the front, rear, and center diffs, which I made a separate video for that you can watch. Other things that I had changed, if we perhaps start at the rear, is I'm using Lunsford titanium turnbuckles here for the front and the rear. For the camber links, I'm using 3x48mm turnbuckles. And as you can see, I'm using modern Kyosho ball ends and ball studs. So I think these are the medium length ball ends. So these seem to work just about right for the amount of length I need for the camber links for the front and the rear. I do have a set of 3x42mm turnbuckles left over from my Rampage Pro E conversion that I'm going to try to make work for the actual steering links. That should be long enough. And of course the ball ends that Kyosho makes, they make a whole assortment of different lengths. So I should be able to make this length of turnbuckle work just fine for the steering. So I'm not too worried about that. As for the rear hub carriers, clearly you can see this is from the Kyosho RB5 series. So this is a 3 racing aluminum aftermarket rear hub carrier for the Kyosho ZX5 RB5. You can also use it for the RB6. It's basically the same part. It has 2 holes on the bottom for mounting the rear hub carrier, so you can change the total amount of droop at the rear, also the rear roll center if you want to. And I chose to use this hub carrier instead of the stock hub carrier for this car, which is actually the same as what you would get with the Kyosho Laser ZX or ZXR. It's this guy here, because this one, the ball studs mount in and out. Okay, so you only have 2 roll center options, but you get 3 camber gain options. Here you get 2 options for camber gain, but because the ball stud mounts vertically, you can change the roll center in much finer increments. Also, it turns out that the geometry of this hub carrier is almost exactly the same as what you have for the RB5 and ZX5 hub carriers. So really, it's like a 1-to-1 replacement, which is quite nice. The only difference is the bottom holes here on the original Laser and Inferno 10 hub carrier. You can see the holes are not perfectly straight up and down between the top and bottom hole. There's actually a bit of an angle there. On these hub carriers, the more modern ones, those holes are completely vertical. Okay, so I don't know exactly why Kyosho did it this way on the older hub carriers, but otherwise, the geometry, the bearings you use, everything else, it's basically a perfect fit for these more modern hub carriers here. So I decided to use this, and for the universals, because the Inferno 10 came with dog bones front and rear, I wanted to put universals on. I do have a set actually of MIP CVDs for the Inferno 10. Actually, I have 2 sets, which is great, but I want to save these for later for maybe a different build. Instead, I'm using universals for the Kyosho Optima. Again, the Optima re-release has given me some options for what I could do with this build, because there are parts that are interchangeable between the Optima and the Laser. And it turns out that the universals are one of them. So these particular universals are from Jazz Rider. You can find them on eBay. These are actually made of aluminum. They're not made of steel. I'm using them front and rear. They're the perfect length. They're a perfect fit. There's no problem. There's no issue with, the dog bone pins being too close to the diff outrize or any of that, nonsense. It's basically a perfect fit. Because they're aluminum, they should be lighter weight, which is good. Although I don't know exactly how well they're going to wear over time. Especially at this U-joint here. Maybe it'll experience a little bit more wear than like a steel CVD, for example, like the MIP CVDs. But we'll just have to see how that goes. Moving on to the front, same thing with the universals and the turnbuckles. The only thing here with the front camber link is I had to use Traxxas rod ends. So you can get part number 1942. These are actually really good rod ends, and you get a whole bunch of them. So I can use them for a whole bunch of builds. And the reason why I had to do that is because when mounting the outer part of the camber link onto the caster block, you need a captured ball end or a rod end like this because of how at least for the stock setup, this end is also part of the kingpin that goes into the steering knuckle. If you were to use any of the other holes on the caster block, there's a hole over here, and there's also a hole on the inside. You could theoretically use just a conventional ball stud with a ball cup. But if you're using this stock setup where this screw is like an 18 millimeter long screw, it goes all the way down through this rod end, through I think a 2 millimeter spacer, and then down into the steering knuckle here, you have to use a captured ball end or rod end like this. And for the inside here, it's kind of the same story. You have to use the same type of rod end because the screw goes through the tower and then into this little gap here, okay? And then there's also a piece that extends from the gearbox here that you can mount the screw through, and so the rod end just sits in between that. And the actual metal insert, the ball insert that goes into the rod end, doesn't pick up all of the gap here between the tower and this little brace. So I just put a little, I think it's a 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter spacer on the back side here of this inner part of the camber link. So I think there's another hole also to the inside of this hole. But the problem is the only hole that actually lines up between this little ear piece here and the tower is on this part of the tower. So if you want to use any of these other holes here on the tower for, camber link adjustment, or even any of the holes here on the ear for camber link adjustment, you need to use a totally different setup. Maybe put a ball stud on the back side over here on either of the two holes. Sorry, there's one hole here. Sorry, just one hole here. Yeah, one hole here. My apologies. But then if you wanted to use, say, this hole here to maybe increase the roll center a little bit, reduce the camber gain, I'm not exactly sure how you would enable that. Maybe I use a shorter screw and then put like a 3 millimeter nut in here to tighten everything down. That's maybe one way to do it. So adjusting camber gain and roll center on the inside part for the front camber link is going to be tricky. So if anything, you're probably better off doing it on the caster block here. Right now I'm using the stock caster blocks, which is the same as you would get in a Laser ZX or ZXR. I think it's on this side here. There's a little bit more bind between the knuckle and the caster block than there is on this side. It rotates much more freely. That's because this caster block, for some reason, the top part is bent down a little bit. So when you insert the steering knuckle, it doesn't spin quite as freely. So I'm going to try to use just some fresh, new and packaged caster blocks once I get some in the mail. And then going actually to the bottom of the caster block, there's a neat little trick that I found from whatever original owner had this, did this in a way that allowed you to not have to use a kingpin on the bottom. So normally there's a specific kingpin that you would use on the bottom side here of the caster block to mount the steering block. But what you can actually do is just take a 3 millimeter screw, and then there is a specific type of Tamiya washer. It's more like a sleeve, and it's maybe about 0.5 millimeter thick or so, and it can slot or fit around the 3 millimeter screw, and it fits perfectly inside the opening here for the caster block. And it's also the perfect thickness for the thickness of the bottom part of this caster block. So you can just slot that right in and put a 3 millimeter screw in, and you're done. You don't need to have to worry about having the correct kingpin to use for this particular type of steering knuckle, because those kingpins are much less common. It's a specific part, and they don't make them anymore, I don't think. They're much less common than just getting a 3 millimeter screw of the appropriate length. So I have that, And then for the actual wheel hexes, these are just RB6 plastic wheel hexes. Again, these are a placeholder until I get some aluminum clamping units. I plan to use the same type of aluminum clamping units that I used for my Rampage Pro E build. So those are from Integy. They're a 6mm wide clamping wheel hex that also fits on. It's made for Tamiya and Axial chassis, but it's the same exact size that you would use on a Kyosho chassis to fit the wheel axle. Although it's a little bit wider. I think these are 5mm wide. Those are 6mm wide, but that should be fine for me. So this is more or less it. The only other things to talk about are maybe the bottom of the chassis, where I've had to countersink any of the screw holes that I'm using for mounting, like, you know, the mount for the center diff, or for mounting the rear gearbox, or you know, mounting the front bumper. I had to countersink the front bumper. The original kit didn't have any countersunk holes here on the bottom of the chassis and for the bumper, so you had just conventional screws with conventional screw heads, like, say, let me see if I can find one here. Yeah, like something like this, like a button head type of screw head, and these are all just sort of sticking out from the bottom of the chassis. So if you're going to drive this on, you know, a manicured track, you don't want to have it. You want to have a nice flat chassis where the screws aren't digging into the dirt or anything like that. So I'm trying to countersink everything. And then for the backside here, this will be a little bit tricky because both the front and back of the chassis have openings here for the gear diff, because the gear diff protrudes a little bit into the thickness of the chassis. On the front, that's no problem because the front bumper covers everything up. But on the rear, originally, you would have a little metal plate. Let me find it right here. This little guy right here. And this would screw right on and cover this hole. But the thing is, this plate is too thin to countersink this plate. And so I have to countersink the chassis here and basically not use this plate. This plate's useless for me right now. So then the question is, how do I seal this up? You know, one thing I'm thinking is using some chassis protective film to just make you know, cut a little square out or a rectangle or something, seal it off like that, and then in addition to that, cut a little piece of Lexan out and tighten the Lexan down, you know, or secure it with these 4 screws. So that would assure that if any dirt gets in between that Lexan and the chassis, that at least I also have that chassis protective film covering this hole here to keep dirt from getting in and mucking up with the gearbox. So that's what I plan to do for the rear opening there. Other than that, one thing that I have found here is that the rear suspension arm droop seems to be perfectly acceptable, but the front droop does seem to be a bit lacking. And that appears to be because there are actual notches here on the chassis to limit droop. And if I could cut these out, and I probably will, either for this chassis or a different chassis, then I could probably get a little bit more droop at the front, which should make it much better for jumping and landing. As it is right now, the amount of droop it has is maybe comparable to something like my old B44.0, which was a very good buggy, but it didn't have a lot of front droop, and it was a real pain in the ass to get it to jump and land correctly on tracks that had big jumps with no landing. So I want this to have, you know, at least front droop that can get you kind of close to where you can also get to the rear. So, you know, one thing you might want to do is just cut out these ears here. That will allow the arm to drop a bit down a bit more, give you a bit more droop. So I'm going to play around with that as well. So there's still a bit to go here for fine-tuning things with the chassis. I still have to install the steering rack. My plan is to use Kyosho ZX6 steering rack. This is almost exactly the same part as the special blue steering rack that some people use for the Laser ZXR and the Super 10 and the Inferno 10. Almost the exact same part. The only difference is the horn here has 1 hole instead of 2 holes. That's the only difference. And this part is like $6, and the special blue part, because they're so rare, they sell for like $40. So I want to mount that here and use a ZXR type drag link as opposed to the original setting for the Inferno 10, which I think was a little crappy. So I got to work on that. I got to work on how I want to mount the motor and the electronics. So still plenty to go. But this is where I am right now. And I hope you find this helpful. And thanks for watching.